Welcome, dear listener. Imagine a quiet summer morning in the year 1518 in the bustling little city of Strasbourg, where narrow cobbled streets wound between timber-framed houses, and the air carried the mingled scents of baking bread, fresh hay, and the faint tang of the nearby river. It was the kind of morning where life felt simple, predictable, steady, as the turning of a wheel. Merchants set out their goods, children chased each other in the alleys, and church bells chimed softly over the rooftops. But on this particular day, something strange began. It started with a single woman. Her name, the records say, was Frau Trophäa. No one knew why she stepped into the narrow lane that morning, her feet tapping lightly against the stones. At first, it seemed almost innocent. Perhaps she was humming a tune only she could hear. Perhaps she had reason to celebrate, though no festival had been declared. The neighbors paused, curious. They watched as she moved her arms and swayed her hips, her skirts brushing the dusty ground, her sandals clattering in a steady rhythm. But there was no smile on her face, no laughter in her voice. Her eyes were distant, as though fixed on something far away, something no one else could see. An hour passed, then two, and still she danced. Some called out to her, asking if she was well, but she did not answer. The baker's wife crossed herself. The blacksmith muttered about spirits, and the children, once amused, began to watch in uneasy silence. By the time the sun reached its highest point, Frau Trophäa's movements had grown faster. Her cheeks were flushed, her breathing sharp, and yet she did not stop. Even as the shadows lengthened and the street cooled, her feet kept moving, as though some unseen force had wound her like a clock and thrown away the key. No one knew it then, but this was only the beginning, and by week's end, the streets of Strasbourg would be filled with dozens, maybe hundreds, dancing without music, without joy, and without any hope of stopping. By the following morning, rumors began to swirl through Strasbourg. Neighbors whispered in narrow alleys. Merchants paused their work to watch the growing crowd. Frau Trophäa was still dancing, her feet moving tirelessly, her face pale, her eyes wide with some strange, unspoken terror. Then, as if drawn by an invisible force, another woman stepped into the street, her movements awkward at first, then rhythmic, matching the strange pattern of Frau Trophäa. People gasped. Some laughed nervously, thinking it a curious spectacle. Others crossed themselves, murmuring prayers. By midday, a dozen people were dancing, their feet pounding the cobblestones, the air thick with the sound of rapid movement and the occasional cry of exhaustion. Doctors were summoned. Their advice was strange and varied. Hot blood, one said. Fever of the mind, another. But no one could stop it. Families watched helplessly. Parents tried to pull their children away, but some children joined in, as if the dancing were contagious, like a strange, invisible disease. The city council grew alarmed. Meetings were held behind closed doors. Decisions were made to clear the streets, to separate the dancers from the rest of the citizens. But even walls and barriers could not contain it. By the end of the third day, dozens more were caught in the frenzy, their bodies moving without rest, their eyes glazed with a distant focus. And yet, no one could explain why. No one could cure it. The streets themselves seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the dancing, as if the city had become a living heartbeat, drawing more and more souls into its unstoppable motion. Priests prayed loudly from doorways, candles flickered in tiny chapels, and whispers spread of a curse, a punishment from forces unseen, or perhaps some madness that had chosen Strasbourg as its stage. By the fourth day, the dancers' movements became more frantic. Blisters formed on their feet, sweat soaked their clothes, yet they could not stop. The city began to tremble under the weight of this strange, unstoppable plague. By the fifth day, Strasbourg had begun to change. Shops were left unattended, streets half empty, and the air smelled of sweat, dust, and fear. Those not dancing whispered in corners, glancing nervously at every passerby. Some stayed indoors, drawing curtains and locking doors, praying that the madness would not find them. But it did. People who had laughed at the spectacle before now trembled with dread. Neighbors tried to help, offering water, blankets, even gentle hands to guide the dancers. Yet many were pushed away, their eyes fixed on some invisible rhythm, their bodies refusing to obey reason. Families became fractured, fathers watched mothers dance, children watched parents, and the fear of loss hung heavy over every home. Even the animals seemed disturbed, dogs whining, cats hiding, as if sensing the unnatural force that gripped the city. Priests and city leaders worked tirelessly, holding processions, offering blessings, ordering exorcisms. But the dancing continued, unrelenting day and night, like the ticking of some monstrous clock. By the sixth day, dozens had been affected. Some collapsed in the streets, their bodies exhausted, their eyes still glazed, as if the dance would never let them go. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said it was a curse from God. Others whispered of witches, and some feared that the devil himself had chosen Strasbourg as a stage. Doctors tried remedies. Herbs, potions, and prayers were given. None worked. The city could only watch, helpless, as more and more fell victim to the invisible rhythm. By the seventh day, the streets were filled with a strange, chaotic energy. The sound of pounding feet echoing like distant drums, and the city itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something no one could name. No one knew how long it would last. No one knew why it had begun. But everyone could feel one thing. Strasbourg would never be the same. By the eighth day, Strasbourg was no longer a city of normal life. The streets were filled with dancers, their movements frenzied, their bodies raw from endless motion. Some had fallen in the streets, their feet blistered and bleeding, their faces pale, their eyes still fixed on the unseen rhythm. Families cried out for their loved ones, trying to pull them to safety, but many resisted, as though the dance had claimed them entirely. Merchants abandoned their shops, the bakers' ovens went cold, and the smithy's hammer fell silent. Only the sound of pounding feet echoed through the city like a terrible heartbeat, constant and inescapable. Priests prayed fervently, their voices rising in the chapels, calling on God to end the plague. Some held processions through the streets, sprinkling holy water, chanting psalms, but even their prayers seemed to fall on deaf ears. By the ninth day, more dancers collapsed from exhaustion, some never rising again. Whispers of death began to spread, but still others joined the streets, drawn by some invisible force, their bodies moving against their will. Parents screamed, children wept, neighbors trembled. Fear had taken hold of every heart in Strasbourg. The city felt as if it were holding its breath, waiting for the madness to consume it entirely. Doctors tried again and again, herbs, ointments, and potions, but nothing could stop the dance. It seemed unstoppable, a force beyond human control, a madness that had chosen Strasbourg as its stage. By the 10th day, the streets had become a strange living rhythm, the sound of pounding feet echoing like thunder, and the city itself seemed caught in a nightmare, unable to wake, trapped in the dance of death. By the 11th day, Strasbourg was a city transformed. The once busy streets were now a maze of dancing bodies, their movements relentless, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes glazed with exhaustion. Neighbors no longer spoke above whispers, fear hanging heavy in the air. Parents wept quietly in corners, watching children move as if possessed, their tiny feet pounding the cobblestones endlessly. Merchants abandoned their shops completely, the baker's ovens cold, the smithy's hammer still. Even the wind seemed hushed, as if afraid to disturb the relentless rhythm of the city. Priests and doctors worked side by side, prayers and potions offered in equal measure, but each attempt failed. The dance continued, growing more frenzied, as if the city itself had been cursed. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some claimed it was the wrath of God, others whispered of witches or evil spirits. Some believed the devil had chosen Strasbourg, a city to torment for his amusement. By the 12th day, those who had collapsed in the streets began to be counted among the dead. Still, the dance continued, drawing more and more into its grip, their bodies moving of their own accord as if puppets of some invisible force. Fear had seeped into every home, every mind, every heart. Even those not dancing felt it, a cold shadow pressing on their souls, an unshakable dread that whispered the madness could touch anyone at any moment. And yet, despite exhaustion, despite death, the dance did not end. It was unstoppable, unforgiving, a terrible rhythm that held the city in its relentless grip, and no one knew how or why. By the 13th day, Strasbourg itself seemed alive with the rhythm, its heartbeat measured in the pounding feet of the dancing, a city suspended between fear and fascination, unable to break free, caught in a nightmare that had no clear end. By the 14th day, Strasbourg was a city of shadows. The streets echoed endlessly with the pounding of tired feet, the air thick with dust, sweat, and fear. Families were fractured, parents unable to save their children, children watching parents consumed by the strange rhythm, and neighbors hiding behind closed doors, praying to be spared. Those who had danced the longest were pale, exhausted. Some collapsed in the streets, their bodies broken by the relentless movement, their eyes still fixed on some unseen rhythm. Doctors and priests worked tirelessly, running from street to street, offering herbs, ointments, prayers, and blessings. None of it helped. The dance continued, a force beyond understanding, beyond control. Rumors spread faster than ever. Some believed Strasbourg had angered God, others whispered about witches, curses, and some feared a darker power, something unseen, that had claimed the city as its stage. By the 15th day, hundreds were caught in the madness. Blisters and exhaustion could not stop them, and the dead lay unnoticed in the streets, their bodies a grim testament to the unstoppable force that gripped the city. The air itself seemed heavy, each breath carrying the weight of fear, and every glance out a window revealed the horror of movement without end. Even the animals were restless, dogs howling, cats hiding, as if the unnatural rhythm had spread beyond the human, touching everything in the city. By night, the sound of pounding feet continued, echoing through darkened streets, the lamps flickering in silence, and the city held its collective breath, waiting for an end that no one could see, hoping for mercy that might never come. By the 16th day, Strasbourg was unrecognizable. The streets were filled with dancers, hundreds moving without rest, their feet raw, their bodies trembling, their eyes fixed on some invisible rhythm. The air was thick with fear. Families huddled in their homes, afraid to leave, afraid to watch, afraid that the dance would claim them too. Priests and doctors had grown desperate. They tried every remedy, every prayer, every potion and chant. Nothing worked. The madness continued, growing stronger with each passing hour. Whispers spread of death in the streets. Some who had danced the longest collapsed and never rose again. Others joined the frenzy, their bodies moving as if controlled by some unseen force, unable to stop even when exhaustion overtook them. The city council panicked. They sent people to try to separate the dancers, to lead them into fields outside the city, but even wide-open spaces could not contain the plague. It seemed to follow them, a relentless force, touching anyone, anywhere, without mercy. By nightfall, the city itself seemed alive with the rhythm. The echo of pounding feet reverberated through every alley, every square, every empty house. The lamps flickered in the windows, casting long, trembling shadows. And the people who watched from behind curtains felt the pull of the dance in their bones. No one knew how it would end. No one knew why it had begun. All that remained was the sound, the relentless motion, and the fear that Strasbourg might never be free. By the 20th day, something changed in Strasbourg. The dancing slowed, almost imperceptibly at first, then gradually more, until the city seemed to breathe again. Frau Trophäa, the first to dance, finally stopped. Her legs shook, her body trembling, but she could stand still. Others followed one by one until the streets were quiet. No pounding feet, no frantic movement, only the echo of what had passed. Families stepped outside slowly, looking at each other with relief and grief. Some embraced loved ones, others wept for those who had been lost, or for those who would never dance again. The priests gave thanks. The doctors recorded their observations, but still, no explanation was found. No curse was proven, no sickness identified, only a strange, terrible event that had seized the city and then let it go. The city slowly returned to life. Merchants reopened their shops, children played in the alleys, and church bells rang once more. Yet, Strasbourg would never forget. The memory of the dancing, the fear, the unstoppable rhythm lived on in whispered stories, passed from one generation to the next. Even today, historians debate what happened. Was it mass hysteria? A neurological disorder? A curse from forces unseen? No one knows for certain. But for those who were there, and for those who listen closely, the memory lingers, a haunting echo of a city that danced itself to the edge of madness and then, slowly, found silence once more. By the 21st day, the streets of Strasbourg were quiet at last. The relentless pounding of feet had ceased, leaving behind only silence, dusty footprints, and the faint scent of sweat and fear. Those who had survived stood trembling in the streets, their bodies weak, their faces pale, their eyes haunted by memories they could not forget. Families reunited, embracing loved ones with tears and mourning those who had been lost. Neighbors helped each other, lifting the fallen, carrying the wounded to safety. Priests walk slowly among the people, offering prayers and blessings, their voices soft, their words echoing in the quiet streets. Doctors recorded the aftermath, writing notes in their journals, hoping future generations could understand, though even they admitted that no explanation would ever satisfy. The city began to breathe again, shops reopened, children played carefully in the alleys, and church bells rang once more. Yet, Strasbourg would never be the same. The memory of the dancing, the fear, the unstoppable rhythm lingered in every corner, every shadow, every whispered story. Even decades later, the people spoke of it with a shiver. The dancing plague of 1518, an event that no one could fully explain, a force that had claimed the city and then vanished, leaving behind only questions and the haunting memory of a city that danced itself to the edge of madness. And so, dear listener, remember the tale of Strasbourg and Frau Trophäa, and the city that could not stop moving. For history sometimes whispers in ways we can hardly understand, and some mysteries never truly end. As the days turned to weeks and the city slowly returned to its routines, people still felt the weight of what had passed, a quiet tension in the air, a lingering sense of unease. Stories were told in hushed voices, around fires, in kitchens, and in quiet corners of the taverns, about those who had danced, those who had watched, and those who had been lost. Historians would later write, attempting to understand, to explain the madness, but the truth remained elusive. Was it hysteria? A strange disease? A curse? No one could say for certain. Yet, for those who had lived through it, the memory was etched in their minds, a reminder of how fragile life could be, how quickly the ordinary could turn into the extraordinary, and how a city and its people could be bound together by fear, by hope, and by the inexplicable. And so, Strasbourg found its peace slowly, day by day, the echoes of the dancing fading, leaving only the quiet whispers of history. Dear listener, remember the tale of 1518, remember the city that danced, and the unseen force that gripped it. For some mysteries, though ancient, still whisper their secrets to those who listen closely. And now, as you rest, let the story settle. Let the streets of Strasbourg fade into the night and drift slowly into a quiet, peaceful silence. Weeks turned into months, and Strasbourg slowly healed. The city's streets once again filled with merchants, children's laughter, and the ringing of church bells. But for those who had witnessed the plague, nothing would ever feel quite the same. Each shadow, each quiet corner carried a whisper of the past. Stories passed from one generation to the next, tales of dancing in the streets, of exhaustion and fear, and the unexplainable force that had gripped the city. Scholars and historians debated endlessly, trying to unravel the mystery, yet no one could fully explain it. The plague remained a riddle, a haunting echo of human fragility and the strange power of the unseen. Even today, if you walk through Strasbourg, through the winding alleys, over the cobbled streets, you might feel it. A whisper in the air, a faint rhythm beneath your feet. Some say it is the memory of Frau Trophäa and those who followed her, moving tirelessly in a city held hostage by a strange, invisible rhythm. And so, dear listener, remember the story, remember the city that danced, and the lessons it leaves behind about fear, about resilience, and the mysteries that lie beyond understanding. As you rest, let the echoes fade. Let the city sink into silence and carry with you the memory of a time when Strasbourg danced itself to the edge of madness. Days passed quietly, but the streets of Strasbourg still carried whispers, the echoes of the dancers, their footsteps etched into the cobblestones. Those who had survived moved slowly, their eyes haunted by what they had seen. Families spoke softly in homes, afraid to speak too loudly, afraid the memory might awaken again. Merchants reopened shops, but even their laughter felt hollow. Their hands shook as they counted coins, and the ovens smelled sweeter because they feared it might be the last warm bread. Children played carefully, watching their parents' faces, learning from the silence and from the stories that were told in hushed, careful tones. Priests walked the streets, reminding the city to pray, to give thanks for survival. But their eyes also held fear, for the madness had left marks not only on bodies, but on souls. And in the quiet of night, when the lamps flickered and the wind whispered through the alleys, some claimed they could still feel the rhythm, a faint, distant beat beneath their feet. Strasbourg was alive again, but forever changed, its streets carrying secrets, its people carrying memories, and the story of a city that had danced itself to the edge of reason. Even weeks after the dancing had ended, the alleys of Strasbourg carried a strange silence, broken only by the cautious footsteps of those who dared to walk outside. Neighbors peeked from windows, sharing quick whispers, stories of those who had danced longest and of those who had fallen quietly in the streets. Children remembered the pounding rhythm, though they had been too small to join, their imaginations haunted by fleeting shadows and the faint echo of invisible drum. Merchants tried to bring normalcy back, but their hands trembled, their voices often faltering, as if the city itself held its breath, still wary of the unseen force that had claimed it. The priests continued their rounds, blessing the streets, sprinkling holy water and chanting prayers softly, their eyes scanning the corners as if expecting the madness to return. At night, the city seemed to hum faintly, the memory of the dance lingering in the air, a rhythm so subtle it was almost imperceptible, yet unmistakable to those who had survived. And so, Strasbourg moved carefully, step by step, each day a cautious promise that life could continue, even after the shadows had danced through every street. Days turned into weeks, and Strasbourg slowly tried to return to normal. Shops reopened, children played in the alleys, and the streets seemed familiar again. Yet the people moved cautiously, their eyes darting to shadows, their ears straining for faint echoes, reminders of the madness that had once claimed them. Families whispered late at night, sharing memories of those who had danced and those who had vanished, their voices soft, as if speaking too loudly might awaken the past. Merchants counted coins nervously, bakeries smelled warm and inviting, but every footstep on the cobbles seemed louder than before. Priests walked slowly through the streets, blessing homes, speaking quietly to those who had survived, reminding them to give thanks. But even they carried unease in their hearts. And at night, when the lamps flickered and the wind passed through narrow alleys, some claimed they could hear it, a faint, distant rhythm, like the whisper of dancing feet. Strasbourg had survived, but the city itself seemed changed, its heartbeat slower, its people more watchful, its shadows deeper, and its stories heavier with memory. As Strasbourg recovered slowly, new faces appeared in the streets. Merchants from distant towns, travelers seeking opportunity, and families hoping for a fresh start. Yet, even the newcomers sensed it, the quiet tension in the air, the way windows were half shuttered and doors closed with cautious hands. Some whispered about the dancing, their voices trembling with disbelief. Others listened silently, trying to imagine a city that had moved itself to the edge of madness. Children grew curious, asking questions softly to parents who answered carefully, sharing only what they thought was safe. Merchants tried to rebuild, baking bread, opening shops, counting coins, and speaking words of encouragement. But at night, when the lamps flickered and shadows stretched long across the alleys, even the newcomers felt it, a faint rhythm beneath their feet, a whisper of something unseen. Strasbourg's streets had healed in appearance, but the memory lingered, carving its way into every corner, every shadow, every heart that walked there. And so, the city moved forward, step by cautious step, learning to live with whispers of the past and the invisible rhythm that had once gripped it so completely. Mornings returned to Strasbourg slowly, sunlight spilling over cobbled streets, merchants arranging their goods, and children venturing carefully outside. Yet the city moved with caution, each footstep measured, each glance lingering on shadows as if expecting the madness to return. Parents whispered lessons to their children about resilience and caution, about life continuing even after fear had swept through their homes. Newcomers tried to adapt, smiling at the shops and laughter, but some nights left them restless, sensing a faint rhythm echoing from streets long emptied of dancers. Priests continued their prayers, soft chants flowing through the alleys, offering blessings, yet their voices carried unease, for even they could not forget the city's past. Even as Strasbourg rebuilt itself physically, the memory of the dancing remained, a quiet pulse beneath the daily routines, reminding all who walk there that some stories linger, some rhythms never fade entirely. And so the city, its people, and even its shadows moved forward slowly, learning to live with the echoes of what had been. Even as Strasbourg rebuilt, the streets carried memories, footsteps echoing faintly, as if the city itself remembered. Survivors walked carefully, their eyes scanning shadows, their hearts still beating with the rhythm of a madness they could never forget. Parents spoke quietly to children, warning them of the unseen and teaching them how to live cautiously, how to notice what others might ignore. Merchants arranged goods with care, and travelers whispered of the city's strange past, their voices trembling, sharing tales of dancers who moved without will. Priests continued to pray softly, endlessly, offering blessings to homes, to those who had survived, and to the streets themselves. At night, when lamps flickered and winds whispered, even newcomers felt it, a faint pulse beneath the cobblestones, the echo of feet long gone. Strasbourg had survived, its body healed, but its soul carried shadows, a rhythm lingering quietly, waiting in corners, in alleys, in the hearts of those who listened closely. Strasbourg moved forward cautiously. Merchants opened shops with careful hands, the smell of fresh bread drifting through alleys. Children ventured further each day, their laughter light but tinged with hesitation. New faces arrived from distant towns, curious travelers, families seeking opportunity, all unaware of the shadows that lingered. Survivors shared stories softly, whispered warnings to the newcomers, tales of dancing that had seized the city, their voices low, their eyes darting to corners of the streets. Priests continued their rounds, blessing homes and shops, offering words of reassurance, yet carrying unease in their own hearts. At night, when the lamps flickered and wind whispered through the alleys, some claimed to feel a subtle rhythm, an echo of feet that had once pounded endlessly. Strasbourg had healed physically, but the city's memory remained etched into cobblestones, etched into hearts. A quiet reminder that life can continue, even after madness has passed. And so, the city moved carefully, step by measured step, its people learning to live with echoes of a past they could never forget. Even months after the plague, Strasbourg's streets held a strange stillness, the cobblestones quiet, yet alive with memories. Survivors walked cautiously, their eyes scanning every corner, their hearts alert to a rhythm that could return at any moment. Parents taught children to notice subtle changes, shadows that lingered too long, sounds that seemed familiar but wrong, and to respect the silence of the streets. Merchants worked steadily, yet sometimes paused, hearing the faintest echo of footsteps that no one else could hear. Priests moved quietly, blessing homes with low chants, their voices soft, aware that the city's spirit was fragile and wary. At night, when the wind whispered through alleys, even newcomers felt the pulse, the memory of movement without end, of dancers who had no control over their own bodies. Strasbourg had survived. Its streets were open, its shops were bustling, but the city's heart still carried shadows, a rhythm of the past etched into every stone and corner. And so the people learned to live cautiously, to walk with care, and to remember that some echoes never fully fade. Strasbourg slowly rebuilt itself. Shops reopened, children played more freely, and the smell of fresh bread filled the streets once again. Yet the people moved carefully, their eyes scanning shadows, their ears alert to faint rhythms that seemed to linger in the alleys. Families shared stories of the past, warning children to be cautious, teaching them to notice subtle signs and to respect the quiet of the streets. New travelers arrived, curious and unaware, and the survivors whispered tales, their voices soft, as if speaking too loudly might awaken memories better left alone. Priests continued their blessings, walking slowly from home to home, their chants gentle, yet carrying the weight of the city's history. At night, when the wind stirred through the alleys, a faint pulse could sometimes be felt, the memory of dancers moving endlessly, their rhythm lingering just beneath the surface. Strasbourg had survived physically, but the city's heart remained cautious, its people aware that some shadows and echoes never truly leave. And so, life continued, careful, measured, with a quiet respect for the past and for the invisible rhythm that had once gripped the city so completely. Strasbourg moved slowly into a new rhythm. Merchants arranged their goods carefully. Children's laughter filled the alleys, but even in joy, there was caution. Survivors watched each other, sharing quiet glances, their memories of the dancing still vivid in their minds. Travelers passing through whispered stories, curious and fearful, about streets that once held unstoppable movement, about shadows that seemed alive in the corners Parents told children tales carefully, softly, in hushed voices, teaching lessons of resilience and caution, reminding them that the city had survived, but the memory lingered. At night, the street seemed almost alive again, the wind carrying faint echoes, subtle pulses beneath the cobblestones, a rhythm from the past that refused to fully fade. Priests walked slowly through alleys, sprinkling holy water, chanting softly, reminding the city to remain vigilant, even in peace. Strasbourg had regained life, its streets open, its shops bustling, but its people knew some shadows never fully disappear. Mornings in Strasbourg felt familiar, but a subtle tension lingered. Footsteps echoed differently on the cobblestones, as if the city itself remembered. Merchants worked carefully, arranging goods with measured hands. Children played cautiously in the alleys, learning to move with awareness. Survivors shared whispered stories, reminding each other and newcomers that the city had once been held by a rhythm that no one could control. At night, the wind carried faint echoes, a pulse beneath the streets, barely perceptible, but unmistakable to those who had witnessed the madness. Priests continued their slow rounds, blessing homes, offering prayers for safety and peace, their voices soft, carrying both hope and unease. Even newcomers sensed it sometimes, a quiet thrum in the air, a reminder that Strasbourg had survived, but its heart still carried shadows of the past. And so, the city moved carefully, step by measured step, learning to live with the memory of feet that once danced endlessly, and the invisible rhythm that had changed their lives forever. Even as Strasbourg rebuilt itself, small echoes of the past lingered in the alleys, footsteps that seemed familiar, shadows that seemed to move on their own. Survivors walked carefully, sharing quiet nods and soft whispers, their eyes reflecting memories they could not erase. Children asked questions softly, their curiosity tempered by fear, and parents answered gently, telling only what was safe, keeping the rest hidden in silence. Merchants reopened shops, but often paused mid-step, listening to faint sounds that reminded them of relentless movement. At night, when the lamps flickered, the wind carried whispers, subtle pulses beneath the streets, a rhythm that seemed almost alive. Priests continued their rounds, chanting softly in the alleys, blessing the city with hope, yet aware that the past had left permanent marks. Strasbourg had survived, its streets open, its people cautiously alive, and the city's heart carried the quiet memory of feet that had danced beyond control. New faces arrived in Strasbourg, traders and travelers curious and unaware of the city's past. Survivors watched them quietly, their eyes cautious, their whispers soft, reminding each other of what had once happened. Children peeked from windows, listening to stories in hushed tones, learning to be aware, to move carefully, and to respect the shadows that lingered. Merchants worked steadily, but often glanced at the streets, listening for a rhythm that no longer should exist. Priests walked slowly, blessing homes and shops, their chants gentle, offering comfort and vigilance. Even newcomers sensed it sometimes, a faint pulse beneath the cobblestones, a rhythm from the past, reminding all who listened that Strasbourg had survived, but its heart carried memory, and some shadows never fully fade. And so the city continued, step by careful step, its people living with the echoes and the invisible rhythm that had once gripped every street, nights in Strasbourg remained quiet. Yet a subtle tension lingered in the air, the wind carrying faint echoes through the narrow alleys. Survivors moved carefully, their footsteps measured, their eyes alert to shadows that seemed to stretch and shift on their own. Families whispered to each other, reminding children of the past, of dancers who moved endlessly, and of a rhythm that no one could stop. Merchants closed their shops earlier, their hands trembling slightly as they counted coins, aware of the city's delicate heart. Priests continued their slow rounds, chanting softly, blessing the streets and homes, their eyes scanning corners for signs of the past returning. Even newcomers occasionally paused, feeling a faint pulse beneath their feet, an invisible rhythm that lingered, a memory of what Strasbourg had endured. The city had survived physically, but its spirit carried shadows, and its people walked with awareness, knowing that some echoes never fully fade. The streets of Strasbourg seemed calm, yet whispers of the past lingered. Footsteps that were no longer there still echoed faintly in the minds of those who survived. Children tiptoed through alleys, listening carefully to stories shared by parents, tales of dancers who could not stop, of a rhythm that had overtaken the city. Merchants reopened their shops with care, arranging goods slowly, always aware of the weight of history. Priests walked softly, blessing homes and streets, their voices carrying a gentle warning, a reminder of vigilance, even in peace. At night, the wind whispered through the timber-framed houses, and sometimes, just sometimes, a faint pulse could be felt beneath the cobblestones. Strasbourg had survived, but its people understood that the city's heart still carried echoes of a time when madness danced through every street. And so, life continued carefully, with awareness, with caution, and with respect for the invisible rhythm that had once claimed the city. Strasbourg's mornings grew brighter, shops opened with careful hands, and children's laughter filled the streets. Yet, beneath the routine, a quiet pulse lingered, a subtle rhythm that only some could sense, the memory of dancers moving without control. Survivors walked slowly, sharing soft glances and quiet nods, aware that the city's calm was fragile and that shadows of the past still roamed the alleys. Merchants arranged goods methodically, often pausing to listen, to hear echoes of movement that no one else could hear. Priests continued gentle chants, blessing homes and streets, their voices carrying both comfort and caution. At night, when the lamps flickered and wind whispered through timber-framed houses, the faint pulse beneath the cobblestones reminded all who walked there that Strasbourg had survived, but its heart still held memory, and some echoes never fade completely. Even as Strasbourg's streets filled with life, shadows lingered quietly in corners, moving almost imperceptibly, as if remembering what had once happened. Survivors walked carefully, their eyes scanning alleys, their ears attuned to faint echoes, reminding them of dancers who had moved without will. Children listened to hushed stories, learning to respect silence, to notice subtle signs, and to move cautiously. Merchants arranged goods with care, their hands steady but alert, pausing often to hear sounds no one else could hear. Priests walked slowly, sprinkling holy water, chanting softly through the streets, reminding all to remain vigilant. At night, when the wind whispered through timber-framed houses, the faint pulse beneath the cobblestones was a reminder that the city's heart still carried shadows of the past. Strasbourg had survived physically, but its spirit remained cautious, its people aware that some echoes never fully fade. Strasbourg's streets bustled carefully, merchants opening shops, children venturing a little further each day. Yet, whispers of the past lingered. Soft murmurs carried through alleys, echoes of movement that no one could explain fully. Survivors moved with caution, their eyes scanning every shadow, their hearts remembering the relentless rhythm that had once gripped them. Parents spoke softly to children, sharing stories in hushed tones, teaching them vigilance and the importance of noticing what others might miss. Merchants paused frequently, listening to faint sounds, footsteps that seemed familiar yet belonged only to memory. Priests walked slowly through the streets, chanting soft prayers, blessing homes, and reminding all who listened that peace required awareness. At night, the wind whispered through narrow alleys, and a faint pulse beneath the cobblestones reminded the city's people that Strasbourg had survived, but some echoes never truly faded. New faces arrived in Strasbourg, travelers from distant towns, curious and unaware of the city's history. Survivors observed quietly, their eyes scanning the newcomers, their whispers soft, sharing memories of what had once overtaken the streets. Children peeked from windows, listening to stories in hushed voices, learning to respect the shadows and to notice signs others might overlook. Merchants worked steadily, arranging goods with care, but often paused mid-step, hearing echoes that seemed out of place. Priests moved through alleys, chanting softly, sprinkling holy water, reminding the city to remain cautious. Even newcomers sometimes felt it, a subtle rhythm beneath their feet, a faint pulse of movement that no one could see but everyone could sense. Strasbourg's streets had regained life, but its heart carried shadows. Its people walked carefully, and the city remembered some echoes never truly disappear. Even as Strasbourg's streets grew busier, shadows lingered in the corners, moving almost imperceptibly as if remembering what had once happened. Survivors walked with caution, their eyes scanning alleys, their ears tuned to subtle echoes, reminding them of dancers who had moved endlessly without control. Children listened carefully, learning from hushed stories, respecting the silence of the streets, and noticing the faintest signs of movement. Merchants paused often, arranging goods slowly, listening for sounds no one else could hear. Priests continued their slow rounds, chanting softly, blessing homes and streets, offering comfort, yet aware of the lingering unease. At night, when the wind whispered through timber-framed houses, a faint pulse beneath the cobblestones reminded everyone that Strasbourg had survived, but its heart still carried shadows of the past. And so the city moved carefully, its people aware that some echoes never fully fade. Even as Strasbourg's streets filled with life, shadows lingered quietly in corners, moving subtly, as if remembering what had once overtaken the city. Survivors walked cautiously, their eyes scanning alleys, their ears attuned to faint echoes that reminded them of dancers who had moved without control. Children listened to soft stories, learning to respect silence, to notice subtle signs, and to move with care. Merchants arranged goods carefully, pausing to hear faint footsteps that seemed familiar, yet belonged only to memory. Priests walked slowly through streets, chanting softly, blessing homes and shops, reminding all to remain vigilant. At night, the wind whispered through narrow alleys, and a faint pulse beneath the cobblestones reminded the city's people that Strasbourg had survived. But its heart still carried shadows, and some echoes never truly fade. Strasbourg's streets grew busier, merchants opening shops, children venturing further each day. Yet echoes of the past lingered, soft murmurs through the alleys, footsteps that seemed familiar, shadows that seemed alive. Survivors moved cautiously, sharing quiet glances and whispers, reminding each other of what had once overtaken their city. Parents spoke softly to children, teaching vigilance and the importance of noticing subtle signs, for the streets carried memory. Merchants paused mid-step, listening to sounds no one else could hear. Priests continued their rounds, chanting gently, sprinkling holy water, reminding all to remain alert and careful. At night, the wind whispered through timber-framed houses, and a faint pulse beneath the cobblestones reminded everyone that Strasbourg had survived, but its heart still carried shadows, and some echoes never fade completely. Even as Strasbourg streets came alive with activity, a subtle pulse remained beneath the cobblestones, felt by those who had witnessed the madness, a rhythm no one could fully explain. Survivors walked with measured steps, their eyes scanning corners, their ears tuned to faint echoes that reminded them of dancers who had moved without control. Children listened to hushed stories, learning to respect the silence, to notice the smallest signs, and to walk carefully. Merchants arranged goods slowly, pausing to hear subtle sounds, footsteps that belonged only to memory. Priests moved quietly through the streets, chanting soft prayers, blessing homes and shops, offering comfort, yet carrying the weight of the city's history. At night, when the wind whispered through timber-framed houses, the faint pulse beneath the cobblestones reminded Strasbourg's people that the city had survived, but its heart still carried shadows, and some echoes never fade completely. Even as Strasbourg streets came alive with activity, a subtle pulse remained beneath the cobblestones, felt by those who had witnessed the madness, a rhythm no one could fully explain. Survivors walked with measured steps, their eyes scanning corners, their ears tuned to faint echoes that reminded them of dancers who had moved without control. Children listened to hushed stories, learning to respect the silence, to notice the smallest signs, and to walk carefully. Merchants arranged goods slowly, pausing to hear subtle sounds, footsteps that belonged only to memory. Priests moved quietly through the streets, chanting soft prayers, blessing homes and shops, offering comfort, yet carrying the weight of the city's history. At night, when the wind whispered through timber-framed houses, the faint pulse beneath the cobblestones reminded Strasbourg's people that the city had survived, but its heart still carried shadows, and some echoes never fade completely. Strasbourg streets bustled cautiously, merchants arranging goods with care, children venturing further but keeping watchful eyes. Survivors moved slowly, their glances scanning shadows, their ears attuned to subtle rhythms that reminded them of the dancers who had once overtaken their city. Parents whispered softly to children, sharing lessons of vigilance, teaching them to respect silence and notice the faintest signs of danger. Merchants paused often, listening to echoes that seemed familiar, yet belonged only to memory. Priests walked quietly through alleys, chanting soft prayers, sprinkling holy water, reminding the city to remain alert even in peace. At night, when the wind stirred through timber-framed houses, a faint pulse beneath the cobblestones reminded all who walked there that Strasbourg had survived, but its heart still carried shadows, and some echoes never fully fade. Strasbourg's streets thrived once more. Shops open, children playing, the smell of fresh bread drifting through alleys. Yet beneath the city, a quiet rhythm lingered, a pulse felt only by those who had witnessed the madness of the past. Survivors walked cautiously, their eyes alert, their ears listening for echoes of feet that had moved without will. Parents shared hushed warnings with children, teaching them awareness and respect for the silent streets, for some memories never fade. Merchants paused often, arranging goods slowly, listening for sounds no one else could hear. Priests moved quietly, chanting soft prayers, sprinkling holy water, their voices carrying both comfort and vigilance. At night, the wind whispered through timber-framed houses, and the faint pulse beneath the cobblestones reminded Strasbourg's people that the city had survived, but its heart still carried shadows, and some echoes never fully disappear. Strasbourg awoke slowly, shops opening carefully, children venturing further into alleys, their laughter cautious yet bright. Survivors moved with measured steps, their eyes scanning shadows, their ears tuned to faint echoes that reminded them of dancers who had moved without control. Parents whispered to children, sharing lessons of vigilance, teaching them to notice subtle signs and respect the quiet of the streets. Merchants arranged goods slowly, pausing to listen for footsteps that belonged only to memory. Priests walked softly, chanting prayers, sprinkling holy water, reminding all that peace required awareness. At night, when the wind whispered through timber-framed houses, a faint pulse beneath the cobblestones reminded Strasbourg's people that the city had survived, but its heart still carried shadows, and some echoes never fade completely. Strasbourg's streets moved with quiet energy, merchants arranging goods, children laughing softly in alleys, their steps careful and measured. Survivors walked slowly, eyes scanning corners, ears tuned to faint echoes of dancers who had once overtaken the city. Parents shared stories in hushed tones, teaching vigilance and awareness, reminding children that the streets held memory and some shadows never fully fade. Merchants paused frequently, listening for sounds no one else could hear. Priests moved through the city, chanting gentle prayers, sprinkling holy water, their voices carrying both comfort and caution. At night, when the wind whispered through timber-framed houses, a subtle pulse beneath the cobblestones reminded Strasbourg's people that the city had survived, but its heart still carried shadows, and some echoes never truly disappear. Strasbourg's streets thrived with cautious life shops opening, children playing, the smell of fresh bread drifting through alleys. Yet subtle memories lingered, a rhythm felt only by those who had witnessed the city's madness. Survivors walked slowly, sharing quiet glances and nods, their hearts remembering the relentless movement of dancers who had once overtaken the city. Parents spoke softly to children, teaching vigilance, reminding them that some streets carried echoes of the past. Merchants arranged goods carefully, pausing to hear faint footsteps, echoes that seemed familiar, yet belonged only to memory. Priests moved through the alleys, chanting softly, sprinkling holy water, their voices carrying both hope and caution. At night, when the wind whispered through timber-framed houses, the faint pulse beneath the cobblestones reminded Strasbourg's people that the city had survived, but its heart still carried shadows, and some echoes never fully fade. Strasbourg's streets moved with careful rhythm, merchants opening shops, children playing softly, their laughter light but cautious. Survivors walked slowly, eyes scanning alleys, ears listening for subtle echoes that reminded them of dancers who had once overtaken the city. Parents whispered softly to children, teaching awareness and respect for the quiet of the streets and the memories that lingered. Merchants paused mid-step, arranging goods slowly, listening to faint sounds that belonged only to memory. Priests walked softly through alleys, chanting gentle prayers, sprinkling holy water, their voices carrying both comfort and vigilance. At night, when the wind stirred through timber-framed houses, a faint pulse beneath the cobblestones reminded Strasbourg's people that the city had survived, but its heart still carried shadows, and some echoes never fade completely. Strasbourg's streets filled slowly with life, merchants opening shops carefully, children venturing into alleys, their laughter light but measured. Survivors walked with caution, sharing quiet glances, their ears attuned to faint echoes of dancers who had once moved endlessly. Parents whispered to children, teaching vigilance, reminding them that the streets carried memory, and some shadows never fully fade. Merchants paused often, listening for sounds no one else could hear. Priests moved quietly through the city, chanting soft prayers, sprinkling holy water, reminding all that peace required awareness. At night, when the wind whispered through timber-framed houses, a subtle pulse beneath the cobblestones reminded Strasbourg's people that the city had survived, but its heart still carried shadows, and some echoes never truly disappear. Strasbourg's streets moved with gentle rhythm, merchants arranging goods carefully, children laughing softly, their steps cautious yet lively. Survivors walked slowly, eyes scanning corners, ears tuned to faint echoes of dancers who had once overtaken the city. Parents shared hushed warnings with children, teaching vigilance and the importance of noticing subtle signs. Merchants paused frequently, listening to footsteps that seemed familiar, echoes that belonged only to memory. Priests moved quietly, chanting soft prayers, sprinkling holy water, their voices carrying both hope and caution. At night, when the wind whispered through timber-framed houses, a faint pulse beneath the cobblestones reminded Strasbourg's people that the city had survived, but its heart still carried shadows, and some echoes never fully fade. Strasbourg's streets grew quieter as evening approached, merchants closing shops carefully, children returning home, their laughter fading into the alleys. Survivors moved with careful steps, sharing cautious glances, their ears attuned to faint echoes that reminded them of dancers who had once overtaken the city. Parents whispered softly to children, teaching vigilance, reminding them that some streets carry memories that never fade. Merchants paused mid-step, listening for subtle sounds, footsteps that seemed familiar yet belonged only to memory. Priests moved slowly through the city, chanting soft prayers, sprinkling holy water, their voices carrying comfort and caution. At night, when the wind stirred through timber-framed houses, a faint pulse beneath the cobblestones reminded Strasbourg's people that the city had survived, but its heart still carried shadows, and some echoes never fully disappear. The city seemed to hold its breath, waiting quietly for whatever might come next. As night settled over Strasbourg, the streets emptied slowly, lamps flickering softly along the alleys. Survivors moved cautiously, their steps careful and measured, their eyes scanning shadows that seemed to stretch longer in the lamplight. Parents whispered softly to children, reminding them of the past and teaching vigilance, for some memories never fully disappear. Merchants closed shops with care, pausing to hear subtle sounds that belonged only to memory. Priests walked quietly, chanting prayers, sprinkling holy water, their voices carrying both comfort and caution. Even in sleep, the city seemed to listen. The faint pulse beneath the cobblestones, a reminder that Strasbourg had survived, but its heart still carried shadows, and some echoes never fade completely. Morning broke over Strasbourg, soft light spilling onto cobblestone streets, shops opening slowly, children venturing out carefully. Survivors moved with measured steps, their eyes scanning alleys, listening for subtle echoes of dancers who had once overtaken the city. Parents spoke softly to children, teaching vigilance, reminding them that the streets held memories that lingered. Merchants arranged goods cautiously, pausing to hear faint sounds that belonged only to memory. Priests walked slowly, chanting soft prayers, blessing homes and streets, their voices offering comfort and gentle warning. Even as the city awoke, the faint pulse beneath the cobblestones reminded all that Strasbourg had survived, but its heart still carried shadows, and some echoes never fully fade. Strasbourg's streets moved with quiet energy, merchants arranging goods carefully, children playing softly, their steps cautious yet lively. Survivors walked slowly, their eyes scanning corners, ears tuned to faint echoes that reminded them of dancers who had moved endlessly without control. Parents whispered to children, teaching vigilance and awareness, reminding them that some streets carry memories that never fade. Merchants paused mid-step, listening to subtle sounds that seemed familiar, yet belonged only to memory. Priests moved quietly through alleys, chanting gentle prayers, sprinkling holy water, their voices offering both comfort and caution. At night, when the wind whispered through timber-framed houses, the faint pulse beneath the cobblestones reminded Strasbourg's people that the city had survived, but its heart still carried shadows, and some echoes never fully disappear. Strasbourg's streets awoke slowly, merchants opening shops with care, children venturing further into alleys, their laughter soft and cautious. Survivors moved with measured steps, sharing quiet glances, their ears attuned to faint echoes that reminded them of dancers who had once overtaken the city. Parents whispered stories to children, teaching vigilance and respect, reminding them that the streets held memories that lingered. Merchants paused often, listening for subtle sounds that seemed familiar, yet belonged only to memory. Priests moved quietly through the alleys, chanting gentle prayers, sprinkling holy water, their voices carrying comfort and caution. At night, when the wind whispered through timber-framed houses, the faint pulse beneath the cobblestones reminded Strasbourg's people that the city had survived, but its heart still carried shadows, and some echoes never fade completely. Strasbourg's streets moved with gentle rhythm, merchants arranging goods carefully, children playing softly, their steps cautious but lively. Survivors walked slowly, eyes scanning corners, ears tuned to faint echoes that reminded them of dancers who had once overtaken the city. Parents whispered softly to children, teaching awareness and vigilance, reminding them that the streets held memories that never fade. Merchants paused frequently, listening for sounds no one else could hear. Priests walked quietly, chanting gentle prayers, sprinkling holy water, their voices carrying both hope and caution. At night, when the wind stirred through timber-framed houses, a faint pulse beneath the cobblestones reminded Strasbourg's people that the city had survived, but its heart still carried shadows, and some echoes never truly disappear. Morning came slowly over Strasbourg, shops opening with care, children venturing into alleys, their laughter soft and cautious. Survivors walked with measured steps, sharing quiet glances, ears tuned to faint echoes that reminded them of dancers who had once overtaken the city. Parents whispered stories to children, teaching vigilance and respect, reminding them that the streets held memories that lingered. Merchants paused mid-step, listening for subtle sounds that seemed familiar, yet belonged only to memory. Priests moved quietly through the city, chanting gentle prayers, sprinkling holy water, their voices carrying comfort and caution. At night, when the wind whispered through timber-framed houses, a faint pulse beneath the cobblestones reminded Strasbourg's people that the city had survived, but its heart still carried shadows, and some echoes never fade completely. Strasbourg's streets moved with careful rhythm, merchants opening shops slowly, children playing softly, their laughter cautious yet bright. Survivors walked slowly, sharing quiet glances, their ears tuned to faint echoes that reminded them of dancers who had once overtaken the city. Parents whispered softly to children, teaching vigilance and awareness, reminding them that some streets carry memories that never fade. Merchants paused often, listening for subtle sounds that seemed familiar, yet belonged only to memory. Priests moved quietly through the alleys, chanting gentle prayers, sprinkling holy water, their voices carrying both comfort and caution. At night, when the wind whispered through timber-framed houses, a faint pulse beneath the cobblestones reminded Strasbourg's people that the city had survived, but its heart still carried shadows, and some echoes never fully disappear. Strasbourg's streets stirred gently with morning light, merchants opening shops with care, children venturing into alleys, their laughter soft but cautious. Survivors walked slowly, eyes scanning corners, ears attuned to faint echoes that reminded them of dancers who had once overtaken the city. Parents whispered quietly to children, teaching vigilance and respect, reminding them that the streets held memories that lingered. Merchants paused mid-step, listening to subtle sounds that seemed familiar, yet belonged only to memory. Priests moved softly through alleys, chanting gentle prayers, sprinkling holy water, their voices carrying both comfort and caution. At night, when the wind whispered through timber-framed houses, a faint pulse beneath the cobblestones reminded Strasbourg's people that the city had survived, but its heart still carried shadows, and some echoes never fade completely. Strasbourg's streets moved with quiet energy, merchants arranging goods carefully, children playing softly, their steps cautious yet lively. Survivors walked slowly, eyes scanning alleys, ears tuned to faint echoes that reminded them of dancers who had once overtaken the city. Parents whispered softly to children, teaching vigilance and awareness, reminding them that some streets carry memories that never fade. Merchants paused frequently, listening for subtle sounds that belonged only to memory. Priests walked quietly through the alleys, chanting gentle prayers, sprinkling holy water, their voices carrying both comfort and caution. At night, when the wind whispered through timber-framed houses, a faint pulse beneath the cobblestones reminded Strasbourg's people that the city had survived, but its heart still carried shadows, and some echoes never truly disappear. Night fell over Strasbourg, the streets emptying slowly, lamps casting soft golden light on cobblestones that had witnessed so much. Survivors moved carefully, sharing quiet glances, their ears attuned to faint echoes that reminded them of dancers who had once overtaken the city. Parents whispered softly to children, reminding them of vigilance, and that the streets carried memories that never fully fade. Merchants closed shops with care, pausing to hear subtle sounds that belonged only to memory. Priests walked quietly, chanting gentle prayers, sprinkling holy water, their voices carrying comfort, hope, and caution. As the wind whispered through timber-framed houses, the faint pulse beneath the cobblestones reminded Strasbourg's people that the city had survived, its heart still carrying shadows, and some echoes would never disappear. And so the city slept, holding its memory gently, waiting quietly for a new day, with stories whispered softly through every street, alley, and stone. And so Strasbourg slept, its streets empty, lamps glowing softly in the dark, the wind whispering gently through timber-framed houses. The faint pulse beneath the cobblestones slowed, and even the shadows seemed to rest. Parents tucked children into beds, their whispers fading, their breaths deep and steady. Merchants' doors closed quietly, and priests' prayers dissolved into the night air. All was still, the city's heart breathing softly, holding its memories gently as the world around it drifted into perfect, endless sleep. And now, dear listener, you too can close your eyes and let the quiet streets, the gentle whispers, and the shadows of Strasbourg carry you softly into your own deep, peaceful dream.